Hi everyone, welcome to the Police Foundation Friday Exchange. Uh, Delighted to welcome you all here this afternoon, and it's great that we've got with us today Lee Freeman, who is former Chief Constable of Humberside Police and now one of His Majesty's Inspectors of Constabulary. Thanks very much, Lee, for joining us.
Thank you.
So just some for those who haven't been part of one of these sessions before, just a few things at the outset. I'm going to kick off with some questions for Lee. We're going to have a conversation about a number of different important themes in policing. And if you have any questions or comments as we're talking, then please just put those in the chat function. And as we go along, I'll just pick out questions as we go. I should also say we are recording this and we will be posting it on our YouTube channel, just so people are aware of that before we get started. But yeah, Lee, I think just to kick off, it'd be great. I mean, I'm sure most of those joining know who you are, and one of the reasons they've joined is because they know who you are and want to hear what you have to say. But it'd be good just to give people a sense of your progression through policing, really, and how did you come to join the police, and what was your path through policing after that?
Okay, good afternoon. So after finishing school, I retook some O levels because I didn't do particularly well first time. I was, if I'm honest, a bit more focused on sport and football and cricket than I was academically, which was probably a theme we will touch on before my time when I joined the police. But I eventually did a couple of A levels. I went to Kingston where I did a degree in sociology. It became evident around about 14 or 15. Probably for me, I think everybody else was aware long before then that I was never going to be a cricketer or a footballer, which was my ambition, because I just wasn't good enough. That is the reality. So I left Kingston with a degree in sociology, but no plan exactly what I was going to do with it. I worked for a while in recruitment. I did some travelling. I thought about doing a PGCE, about going into teaching, and I didn't really dive headfirst into policing. I was a bit like a crab on the beach going sideways, and eventually sort of found myself applying for the City of London Police, who I saw advertising in the Evening Standard. It was at the time when they'd had one of their large explosions due to provisional IRA, and there was a massive recruitment in the City of London Police. And I applied and was successful and joined the City of London Police station at Bishopsgate in August '93. I absolutely loved it. I had sort of 3 years on foot patrol in the centre of London, a really nice part of London to police. Those of you who know the City of London will know it has very different and unique challenges to the Metropolitan Police. And to be honest, there were that many of us in the City of London Police at that time. We didn't really need a radio. You could have passed it down the line because there was entry points. I think the commissioner called it Ring of Steel, but there were entry points doing 2 or 3 hours a night or a day, and then the rest of it was on foot patrol. I absolutely loved it, and it gave me a structure and a discipline that I probably needed and was sadly lacking in my own sort of individual discipline towards work and structure and academia, etc. So that's when I joined. I transferred back home towards where I'm from. I'm from Grimsby. Very proud of my roots, and don't live far from there now. My home force was Humberside Police, and when I contacted Humberside Police to transfer back to my home, they weren't recruiting. So I ended up next door at Lincolnshire, and I swapped Tower Bridge and St Paul's Cathedral for the seafront at Skegness in January '96, which was a bit of a rude awakening. And I was a constable for 6 years, mainly in uniform and response, then went into a uniformed proactive unit, plainclothes unit. And it was a sergeant really one night who, during a sort of PDR review, pushed me to say, look, you're coasting, you haven't got a plan. I think you ought to do your sergeant's exam. And there's an advert here for internal applications for what was then called the Accelerated Promotion Course. And just somebody giving me a little bit of self-belief encouraged me, and I applied for both. And I passed the Sergeant's Part 1, and I also found myself, much to my surprise, getting through the Inforce board and then going away for what was sort of the 3-day extended interview process with the Home Office, and I passed that as well. So at 6 years service, I found myself driving through the gates of Bramshill, wondering if I was going on this course with a load of Harry Potters and I was going to get found out. There were some Harry Potters, but most of the people on there were quite normal. And life, professional life, began to move really quickly then. So from being a PC for 6 years, over the course of the next 5 years, rather too quickly, actually, in hindsight, in 5 years, I went from PC to superintendent on that fast track course. And it took a little bit of time for me to catch up with myself, in all honesty. And then obviously things then progressed a little bit more slowly until I found myself in 2017 as the Chief of Humberside. That's sort of the potted history.
Yeah, fantastic. And it must have been quite something for you to be the Chief of Humberside, being the Chief Constable in the area you're from. How did that feel for you?
Really personal, really amazing. There was people in the organisation I went to school with. Yeah. So buying their silence was a key priority because they clearly knew too much about back perms and full perms and wet look gel, which were all the rage in the mid 80s. In my defence, yeah, no, it was really personal. My dad was in Humberside Fire and Rescue all of his professional sort of working career, so I knew a lot of people. I knew people in the force. And I wanted to make a difference for the area that I was from, which is obviously East Yorkshire and northeast Lincolnshire. So yeah, it was very personal, and that gave me a little bit of an opening at the start. But if we hadn't done a decent job collectively, it wouldn't have lasted long, of course, just because you're from the local area. So it caught a little bit of local news at the time. But of course, it's all about then actually making sure you do something with that opportunity, which was the real challenge.
Yeah, well, let's talk a bit about that, because that's obviously, if you like, you made your name as Chief Constable, taking the force from one of the worst performing in the country to one of the best performing in the country, and a force that's still at the is still at the top today. So I guess the sort of basic question is, what did you do, and how did you approach it?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, Humberside historically didn't have a muscle memory or track record of excellence. It, for those of you who've been in police for many years will know that it was initially intervened by the Police Standards Unit under that original guise in the sort of late 90s. It was at the heart of the B-Shard inquiry. I took over at a time when the force had gone into engage. It had an ill-fated change programme in 2015, 2016, and staff were very angry, communities were pretty disheartened, and partners had lost trust and confidence. So, but the thing that gave me hope was that staff were angry, so they still cared. They hadn't given up. I managed to get my head around that I don't need to have all the answers, because I still don't. So if I could surround myself with a good team, a new team, and bring them in who were going to challenge as well as support, and if I could create an environment where if I don't need to know all the answers, then the 4,000 staff that I left, we did increase the workforce as we left. If we create an environment where those individuals would speak up and ask why and contribute to change, it then became really doable. So I was also, there was also a fear of failure, of course, because you're from the area. I have a gene where I like to prove people wrong, and there were 2 or 3 people at that time who were very vocal that it couldn't be turned around and you should just get out, and You certainly haven't got the experience and the ability to do it. So I recognise now that I thrive on that ability to prove people wrong. That's definitely a motivation for me. But I just asked the staff early doors what needed to change. And it was really clear that at the heart of that was they wanted to trust the leadership through behaviours and things that they could see. They wanted to feel valued and supported. They wanted to be involved in change. And they wanted to know what the priority was, because the priority just seemed to be a change programme. So to build with them a simple plan on a page, and for them to feel it was their plan, it was as simple as that. And to bring in a team around me that would help me do that. And if there's one thing I think I did very well, was I picked the right team. I picked a really talented chief officer team to join me. And I also recognised that I had a number of middle and senior leaders in the organisation who were much more talented than perhaps they were led to believe they were, whilst working in a force that had problems. And I think what they did subsequently demonstrated that belief was well founded. No successful organisation exists without having high levels of staff engagement. A jointly created plan that feels like it's our plan, not just something that's been communicated from the top and everyone goes, where's that come from? There's a moral and ethical reason why I wanted to work for an organisation that I headed that made people feel that they were valued. I had a couple of occasions in my career as a senior leader where I hadn't experienced that, and I understood the personal impact of that. So that was very much a touchdown for me, for sure. But there's also a business reason why you want to create an environment where people feel that they are supported and the leaders actually care, because it has an impact on the service they give to the public. You know, Humberside had one of the highest levels of complaints, in fact, the highest levels of complaints before we took over, around incivility and rudeness from officers to members of the public. By the time we really got into the force and started to change the behaviours of all supervisors and managers towards their staff, that had become the lowest, and that was recognised by the IOPC at the time. So there is a direct connection to how you treat your people has a direct impact on how they treat members of the public, or in the private sector, your customers. I don't think it's necessarily unique to policing, or indeed the public sector. So that was a real focus for us. The other bit was maybe trying to recreate or trying to change people's understanding of what strategic leadership is. There's absolutely no point in knowing where you're going to be in 3 years if you don't know where you are every single day. So I, as the Chief Constable, would be going to force tasking, daily tasking every day, not because I was micromanaging, but because it's so important. I really should be knowing what's going on. That creates, because what you permit, you promote. So that creates a change in behaviour. And it was getting our chief inspectors, our superintendents, our chief superintendents to take responsibility on a daily basis of what's going on in their command. And that attention to detail meant that when the inspectorate came in and we got discharged from Engage within about 9 months of me taking over, and then within 13 months, the force got goods across the board for all its inspections. And I actually think that was probably a greater achievement than the subsequent outstandings that the force has got, because that was within about 5 months of being discharged from Engage and we got goods across the board. And the inspectorate shouldn't go into an organisation and find something out that the force don't already know about. How is that possible if we live and breathe it every day? So that attention to detail without micromanaging, which is a fine balance, I think is something that underpins the cultural change as well.
Yeah, fantastic. And one of the things that that's subsequently been sort of rolled out across the country, which was sort of pioneered in your time in Humberside, was what's now become known as right care, right person, in terms of this different approach to the role of the police in dealing with mental health crises and mental health related incidents. Can you talk us through a bit, why you took that on as an issue, and the kind of challenges that you had to overcome to get that implemented locally?
Yeah, so really simply, go back to the things that I mentioned at the start about creating an environment where anybody in the organisation would feel comfortable, even to the Chief Constable, of going, kind of put the hand up and going, why are you doing that? And one of the key bits was just on a regular basis. So there was no back to the floor days or anything like that. The normal way of working for anybody who has a leadership responsibility, including myself and my executive team, is you get out your office every single week, at least 1 or 2 days a week, and you go and speak to the people and ask them what are the things that are stopping them from doing an outstanding job. And what kept coming back from our staff is, you want us to do what we've agreed with you in the plan on the page. We accept that we've got ambition about, going from being the worst graded force to, being one that at the time Durham was seen as the force at the top of the grading from the inspectorate. But actually, we feel like we're a health service, we're a social service, and the stuff that we're taking calls for is preventing us from doing that. It's preventing us from being proactive. It's preventing us from updating victims properly, and it's preventing us from doing the hotspot policing and the proactive targeting offenders that you think we should be doing. And they articulated this repeatedly to us, to the point that we discussed it as an executive team and said, okay, let's check this out. Let's check out the data if that is correct. So we did some work, and it was quite stark, in honesty. I mean, 6% of all calls in the whole force were to do with mental health, which doesn't sound a bit like a big number, but it really is when you take the totality of what's being called into 999 and 101. About 14,000 calls for service a year just around mental health. Many of those absolutely appropriate for the police. So I think that's one of the misunderstandings of right care, right person. We never just pulled away, but many of those were not. Welfare calls for service. These are people saying, I'm a bit concerned about Joe Blogs or Jane Blogs. 25,000 calls for service. So another 11% on top of that 6%, and the 27% increase over the 2 years. And then the force also received 4,500 calls from other agencies, basically abrogating their risk over to us, and we were accepting it. And we attended 70% of calls. So for instance, I don't know, a security at a local hospital is voluntarily treating a patient with no risk of immediate harm, but they've just walked out and they've got a cannula in their hand, and they've let them walk out, and we deployed double cord unit to go and search for them. So I got some legal advice. The legal advice was under common law. Very briefly, we don't own a general duty of care under common law to protect individuals from harm. We owe a duty of care to protect other people from harm if we've assumed responsibility to care for them. So as soon as we take that decision from another agency, we'll deal with that. That risk is now mine as the Chief Constable. Or whether or not we've created risk indirectly or directly, we've got a duty of care. I also got some legal advice about our rights, quite rightly, under the Human Rights Act, duty of care, and also the Children's Act as a statutory partner. And based on that, I had good relationships with social services, local authority leaders, health leaders. We met every other week as a team around place. So I had good relationships. And I wrote them a letter, which didn't come as a surprise, because I had a conversation and say, look, we're going to start to say no. But until we start to say no, I would like to set up a task and finish group led by one of my ACCs, task and finish group, to get practitioners to come round and see if they agree with our assessment. And that was the best thing that we did, because practitioners from mental health trusts, from social services, from local authorities, we produced a pile of about 3,000 incidences, and they just sat there and then going back to their leaders saying, the police shouldn't be dealing with this. The police shouldn't be dealing with this. So it created a bit of momentum. It wasn't without hiccups, but we did it with partners, not two partners, even though there were problems. And I did sometimes have to lock horns and a degree of brinkmanship to get people to the table, particularly in relation to ambulance services, because it meant they had to have a significant investment in additional fleet for the transportation, which we were sometimes doing. But at the heart of this, particularly around mental health, if you have a mental health crisis in a public place, unless you are causing immediate harm to somebody else or yourself, why should you end up in a police van, in a police cell? That wouldn't happen if you broke your ankle. And why should I assume the risk for other agencies because they haven't got the resources to do what they should be doing? well, by doing that, I'm putting victims at risk and we weren't doing our core job. So the genesis came from our staff telling us, and on the principle of we listen and we want to be a snowplow to create space in order for them to do the job that they signed up to do. We did that. And it created an enormous amount of trust from our staff towards the executive team is actually you do listen. Because I did invite everybody to be sceptical in 2017. I did say to them all that you've probably heard it all before. I've heard it before from people I've worked from. So judges and actions are not words. Be sceptical. We're going to come in and we're going to make changes. But if I were you, just watch and make your own mind up. And that did seem to disarm people initially. And then we've got to do something about it. Now, how right care, right person has been rolled out nationally is obviously it's slightly differed in obviously different parts of the force, but it was a real success for us because we were able then to take the time and the resources that we saved, cash those in and make some real investments around, preventing missing children team going in and working with partners, particularly in care homes and children's homes, and to really do some prevention work. And some of the improvements that Humberside landed, particularly in that inspection gradings that we had, where we got the 6 outstanders and the 2 goods across the 8 core appeal grades, there's no doubt some of that would not have happened without creating some of the space and the positivity from our workforce who felt that the executive and their senior leaders were listening to them. Some of that wouldn't have landed, undoubtedly.
Yeah, no, it's a really sort of fascinating journey. That it's interesting what you said about cashing out the savings, because sometimes I think, we've been doing some work on new technologies and the impacts they could have in policing, use of AI, things like that. And one of the things I think that the police don't do enough of is being able to show what they did with the time they saved when they did something. Was that something you were very conscious of? You were sort of saying, look, we're going to save time on this, and I want to be able to demonstrate what we did with that time saving.
Yeah, the reason we were doing it wasn't just because we wanted to push back and get other partners to take responsibility for the risk that they should be doing, and to, of course, to make sure, particularly around people with mental health, that they get the right care, which often is not Humberside Police at the time. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's absolutely appropriate that the police are there, but on many occasions it wasn't. But the real goal was to create capacity in order to do the things that we weren't doing. We weren't arresting people as quickly as we should. We weren't updating victims. We weren't protecting the vulnerable because of resource gaps that we had. And we absolutely wanted to invest around prevention, not just in a team around missing people, but also within our neighbourhood policing team. So, yeah, being able to demonstrate what we did with that was as important as doing it in the first place. And you're right, I've been involved in programs historically in 32 years that actually, you're cited as a real success, but you've never gone back and evaluated. And we built that in right from the start.
Yeah. Great. And of course, I should say to the audience, do chip in with any questions and comments you have in the chat function as we go along. So do feel free to add stuff in, and I'll pick questions out as we progress. And now you're at the inspectorate, and I thought it'd be good. You came out with an inspection report yesterday on the effectiveness of crime investigation by police forces, and I just wondered if you could say a bit about your findings in that report. What were the sort of key highlights, and then we might discuss some of those in a bit of detail.
Yeah, sure. So some of the key highlights was I'll probably start with the demand around policing. It's sort of like a sort of parallel sort of couple of findings, really. There is no doubt that there's an awful lot of pressure at the moment in policing. We didn't find any team, whether it's response, neighbourhoods, investigations, who are involved in the investigation of volume crime, and it's specifically volume crime where that pressure sits, that isn't overwhelmed. It is, we just couldn't find a team that had manageable levels particularly when, quite rightly, victims have a right to expect that when they report a crime online, in person or on the telephone, that crime is recorded, it's assessed, it's processed, it's allocated, and contact is made relatively swiftly. We found that on occasions, the processes and the systems that forces have in how they process what they will sometimes call crime demand is not got the victim at the heart of it. Victims can be sat there in volume crime investigations waiting for 7 to 10 days. That wasn't unique before they've heard anything, because it's been through all these internal processes before it gets to somebody who's on duty is going to make a contact. Undoubtedly, police recorded crime has gone up by 44% in the last 10 years. Police resources have not. Police officers are 6% down, but they are the most least experienced cohort of police officers due to the recruitment cycles that we've probably seen in a generation. 36% of police officers have got less than 5 years service. That was significantly lower 10 years ago. PCSOs have been cut by 50%, over 50% actually, Rick, and police staff around about 16%. So you've got 44% more police recorded crime. It's not the same as crime going up, of course, because forces are now much better and much more ethical at recording their crimes. But these are victims who have a right to expect a high quality investigation. And at the end of it, you want them to feel that the police have actually treated them with compassion and empathy and kept them updated. You want them to be advocates for policing. One of the reasons that trust and confidence may well be hemorrhaging in parts is because we're not creating advocates through volume interactions. Volume crime is a big factor in that, as is 26 million 101 calls that also come in, and many of those are, about 20% of those on average are lost in some forces. So that public trust and confidence bit, that demand bit, is important. So policing probably doesn't have enough resources in order to give the high quality service that it needs at the moment for the volume of police recorded crime. That said, it's almost impossible for chief constables, in my view, to consistently and accurately identify how big that gap is unless they have a forensic understanding of what their crime demand is and it underpins their resource decisions. We did not see that present consistently across the country. So operating models and the resource and investigation teams is not underpinned by an understanding of current demand around volume crime in the same way that it is in more specialist areas. And I think that's problematic. You've also have the issue around the inexperienced workforce. We have people being placed into volume crime teams who are not trained to do that. We have supervisors who are also not consistently equipped and experienced enough in order to do that as well. And that remains problematic. So they were some of the findings, really. And I do think there is a case for nationally, ourselves, the college and NPCC, to really look at maybe how there is really clear guidance around serious and organised and major crime of what a good investigation looks like, and the 5 building blocks that you see. If you go and look at a murder investigation in Merseyside and go and look at one of the Metropolitan Police, you will see real consistency. We haven't got that in volume crime, and the professionalisation of that whole area, it's a challenge for chiefs because of resources and demand, but there is far more that forces could and should be doing with the resources that they have before they're in a stronger position, in my view, in order to put a business case to say they need more resources themselves.
Yeah, and is there, and I know every detective that I speak to says the same thing about unmanageable workloads and so on. But is there you talked about recruitment in the report, and in some work we did a couple of years ago, we found this big shortage of detectives and investigators across the country. Is there do you think that there is a challenge around enough people wanting to be detectives? In other words, do we have enough people who are wanting to specialize in investigation? And if they're not wanting to do that, why is it, and what might we do about it?
Yeah, the short answer to that is yes. That is my experience, both in my previous job and here. But it's understanding the factors that are driving that. There's not an inherent desire to stay away from being an investigator. It's the barriers that are put in place that are making people make those decisions. And some of those are financial. You've got the 24-hour shift allowance that came in a few years ago, quite a while now, in relation to 24/7 policing. You're then potentially in forces asking constables in response teams who, if they've got a really good shift pattern, the one thing that we did well in Humberside was create shift patterns that gave a good work-life balance. And sometimes they weren't the most effective and efficient in terms of the modelling, but the benefit it gave by, a 4-on 4-off for response, for example, gives people a work-life balance. To give that up and to go to an investigation team, which has less rest days because it's problematic for victims if you was away for that long in some investigation teams, and as a sideway move, you might be giving up £3,000 or £4,000 a year because you're giving up your antisocial behaviours, your antisocial working hours payment that came at the back of the Windsor reviews. So they are big issues. It's big issues as well about getting accredited by going through the PIP level 2 accreditation, which you're often having to study in your own time. And even when there's protected learning time provided, workloads mean, because officers and staff are committed to their victims, that they necessarily don't do it, and they do it in their own time. So they are the barriers. The hygiene factors, I think, are preventing people from wanting to be investigators and detectives, not the job itself. The job itself, people enjoy. It's what comes with it.
Yeah, really interesting. And another factor which you mentioned in the report is around technology. And one of the biggest things that's changed in the last decade or two is just the sheer amount of evidence which is now on digital devices and so on. And I know when we've done focus groups with detectives, one of the biggest frustrations they come out with is the amount of time it takes them to get devices examined and that. I mean, is that something that you found in your report? And is there a what do you think needs to happen in that space to kind of, because it feels like there's a bit of a sort of bottleneck in terms of digital forensics, which which means cases are just taking too long to get to resolution.
Yeah, we gave a number of case studies of forces who have had some really good initiatives in this space. Use of robotics, use of automation, investment in technical stuff that can be placed at stations where they can download phones. You're not in massive queues in terms of the digital forensics team. There are forces that, of course, are really struggling with the investment and the accreditation costs in relation to that. And the training means that it's really difficult once you've got somebody trained in digital forensics to keep hold of them. They're very much sought after by the private sector, and policing has a retention issue because of the terms and conditions that we're able to provide as a public sector organisation. So you've got those factors definitely playing a part. I think more fundamentally, though, one of the things that consistently we hear from police staff and police officers is, yes, the complexity and the volume and the demand has exponentially increased in the last sort of 32 years since I joined. Absolutely. And the nature of crime has significantly changed as well. You've got international crime in people's homes now through the advent of fraud and cyber and the vulnerable, etc. But, when you look at how policing often does change in terms of its core systems, I still don't think that case, custody, intel, crime and command and control are as integrated and as user-friendly for making officers and staff's days easier than what they can do. And there is still a lot of frustration in some forces around the technology that's provided to them, and is it fit for purpose? And if you begin to have a look at the quality of files challenge in police forces, which is still not where it needs to be, and it weakens our arguments as criminal justice partners about things like redaction and disclosure, etc., when file quality is so low. Some of the technology that is being used, as well as the training, but some of the technology, officers and staff will say that it actually makes it harder to do the job and more slower than it does compared to the old paper systems. Well, surely the whole point of bringing in technology is to speed up and make those processes more effective and efficient. And I hope in the future there is a national look at the type of technology as core systems that everything else is being built on, that 43 forces in England and Wales continue to use and use very differently.
Yeah. And we've got a few questions coming in now linked to this, Lee. So Jamie asks, do you think we're honest enough with the public about how thoroughly we can investigate volume crime? My experience as a police middle manager was that there was a big gap between what the public expected and what was possible with given resources. For example, simple actions like door-to-door inquiries or identifying suspects via social media accounts was widely expected as basic, but this rarely occurred for volume crime.
And that is consistent. Thank you for the question. That is consistent with our findings. Is that some basic investigative opportunities are not being taken within the volume crime area. I think I'd probably just question about the being honest with the public and what does that mean. So when we got the inspection grades in 2022 for Humberside as a team, and it was 6 outstandings and 2 goods, as I mentioned. But actually, the message to the public when I did the media was acknowledging that we're still letting victims down every single day. And the sort of analogy I was used was, my poor dad used to bring my dad in all the time. But you know, if my dad was a victim of vehicle crime in Grimsby, where he lives, how confident would I be the next day that the service that he was going to get was outstanding for the best graded force in the country? And the answer to that, honestly, was 50-50. So the message to our staff is we have to recognise that if we're going to go out and take these positive headlines, we also need to recognise that I think my dad has a right to expect from the police force that covers his area that he gets, if it's not a response, then he gets a good service over the phone, and he gets at least an explanation if there was no live solvable factors that we can progress as to why nobody comes out and does that, even if it's a neighbourhood officer who's allocated that area to go around to do some house to houses and to do some sort of assessment. I think victims have a right to expect that. And if policing is going to create advocates who are going to stand up for them and say, actually, the forces are not full of predators and they're not full of racist officers, and actually they're trying to do a good job, which we need advocates now in policing, you're going to do that by the service that you give. Now, Chief Constables have got a really, really difficult job because resources at the moment are not matching demand and they've got difficult decisions to make. But I personally always shied away from trying to tell the public that they have no right to expect a better service. I think the point is probably more, if you're asking me, should that conversation be explained in terms of why we're struggling? Yes, absolutely. My own experience is if you're honest with people, both the public and your staff, then actually they at least acknowledge that you're being straight with them. I think one of the issues, certainly when my time as the chief, is when you try to go to meetings and you try and blind people with statistics and telling people who are very unhappy about their local policing that you've reduced burglary by 17% and vehicle crime has gone down by 22%. I'm sure there's many people who sat in those meetings and heard that's not the way to build trust and confidence. But I do think the public have a right to expect an outstanding service as a victim. I don't think we should lose sight of that. That has to be the goal.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lee asks a question. He asked about technology, or he or she asked about technology, which I think you addressed. It says here, many of your recommendations give a deadline for compliance of the 31st of December 2025. What was the thought process behind setting this date, and do you expect forces will respond to them?
So a key part of the discussions with the team, really, and there are some that are slightly longer than that, was just about, I guess, the feasibility of getting a grip with some of these issues and getting the actions completed. And if you end up giving really long dates for completion, then clearly it wasn't a priority. So they're not all of that timescale, but we do certainly give the more tactical ones, the ones that I think are within the grasp of forces to quickly assess, to consider, and to put some actions in place. That was really our rationale about how we came to those dates. Hopefully, the whole system doesn't feel that they're arbitrary. We'll be tracking those for each individual force on the monitoring portal. And of course, when we come back in the next round of PEEL, which we might touch on in a while for 25-27, of course, we will be reviewing progression against those recommendations around investigating crime within question 5, which is our investigating crime CROC. And obviously, we'll focus on volume crime and how some of those actions have been picked up. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think it did. And we've got a couple of questions now about what you were saying about your experience as chief in Humberside. And Gabrielle asks, what Lee has described around his work with Humberside as chief constable to turn the force around is truly impressive. I imagine it came at a personal cost, though. What sort of well-being strategies did Lee use to keep himself balanced? And was he open about this with his team? Leaders being open about their vulnerabilities can be such a powerful force for good within organisations.
That's a good question. Thank you. I think so. Listen, in order to lead, you've got to show who you are, in my view. And trust is it's a feeling, it's an investment, it's not a transaction. People don't trust you by asking them to trust you. So I think you've got to show who you are. I certainly think that in order to do that, you've got to make yourself vulnerable. And I know that I did that in Humberside, because when things go wrong and when people let you down, it gets in. And doing that job for 6 years, after that last inspection, I unexpectedly found myself sat in my office thinking, I think I'm done. I think I've done my job. And some of that was the accumulative impact of, and make no mistake, I wasn't the only one. It was full of people who really care about their colleagues, who want a consistently outstanding service for the people you're there to protect. My welfare strategies were around having a team around me who I could talk to and be vulnerable with and speak to. It was around exercise, around cycling, around playing cricket. In all honesty, I always found that really helped me in terms of endorphins, etc., through exercise. And it was also being comfortable sometimes of just having doubt, and having some people around you outside the organisation they can go and talk to. So I had a healthy dose of imposter syndrome when I took over in Humberside. It was an enormous task that there's no way I could have done it on my own. So the only way to turn that force around was to get some good people in and to listen to the ones that I've got and empower them, and to recruit people as leaders who were going to treat the staff properly. Because again, what you permit, you promote. There's no point in me talking about you've got to look after your staff, you've got to know what they're doing. They will give you permission, if you treat people properly, to have some really, really difficult conversations with them. And I've never ducked difficult conversations, because it always comes from a good place that I want to help. But you've actually got to create an environment where people give you permission to have those. We've all worked for people, I'm sure, who have the insignia on their shoulders and assume the position of authority, but you've never really prescribed it and given it to them. So what they say sometimes goes in one ear out the other. Trying to create an environment where, you know, whenever an officer or a member of staff in Humberside got injured or assaulted on duty, if there was injuries, I used to phone them. And I know I'm not the only chief constable who does that. But what was particularly satisfying after a couple of years is, by the time, after 2 years of those behaviours had happened, when I phoned these individuals, it was quite embarrassing, because the sergeant had already phoned, the inspector had already phoned, the chief inspector was probably at the hospital around the house with them, and the superintendent, the divisional commander had already been in touch. It's that sort of leadership behaviour that I think creates the ability for people to feel vulnerable themselves. And obviously I can't mention names, but you know, it's also about thinking about the promotions that you do. I promoted some senior leaders who had been off with breakdowns, had been off with stress, And I know the message that's sent across the whole organisation to one or two really high profile promotions who people have publicly come and been able to speak about them having breakdowns. It sent the message to the workforce that actually it's a sign of strength sometimes to put your hand up and say, I'm struggling. And one or two times I did that and shared that with my colleagues without obviously becoming and turning it into an encounter group. So I hope that answers your question, Gabrielle.
Yeah, great. And Ruth asked the question, how did you ensure that the change you created in Humberside continued after you left the role of Chief Constable? Given the current short tenure of Chief Constables, how best can forces retain continuity and ensure that good practice and innovation isn't lost when the chief leaves?
Yeah, I mean that is a real test. It was always a real test. If I left and walked away and it all crumbled, then I frankly done a crap job. I'm delighted to say, you know, that 2 years nearly now that after I left and the last inspection, Humberside still got the highest set of grades in the country. That gives me reassurance that the change is embedded right the way through the organisation. Again, I started off by saying that, you know, the force didn't really have a mindset of wanting to be outstanding. That's not a criticism of anybody. That was just the culture in the force. There wasn't the belief that you could be anything other than just okay or a bit rubbish. But as soon as you start tapping into that public service ethos that was there amongst the staff, it absolutely ignited. Culture, I've always felt that culture would withstand individual leaders coming in. I also think that the people who set the culture are not the chief constables. At the end of the day, I never set the culture at the individual stations at Bridlington and Beverley and Grimsby and Scunthorpe and Hull. It's the first line supervisors and managers. And we really worked, and I personally felt that I had a contract and a connection with the type of inspectors and sergeants that people who went for promotion knew that we were looking for. And I had confidence that the people I left behind preferred working within that environment and they would carry it on. Of course, the test of that is what's happened subsequently. It's still an outstanding force. And I'm really positive around what it will look like in the future for them. I think there's a groundswell of behaviours and culture within the organisation that will stand it well in the future. I was just relieved that everything I talked about is not about me and not about my executive team, that since I've left, that performance, that operational performance has carried on, and I think that's really positive.
Yeah, and I mean, just to underline what you say, Ryan says, as a PC who's worked for Humberside Police at Grimsby for 25 years, I can honestly say that the changes Mr. Freeman made were revolutionary. That leadership caused changes at so many levels of policing here. Thank you, sir.
That's really kind. Thank you.
I want to turn back to inspection and just talk a bit about, you mentioned the Peel process, and I know that's part of your portfolio. How do you see Peel developing in its kind of next phase? What are the sort of, you know, what changes have you been making to it, and where do you see it going?
Yeah, so I'm the SRO for Peel. It looks at the force's efficiency, effectiveness and legitimacy over a set time frame, normally 2 years. We go into all 43 forces in England and Wales. Things have changed over the years about how we've done that. So 2014 to 2017, Peel was a 2-week inspection, one in the spring, one in the autumn. Then we moved to a single integrated Peel inspection in 2019, I seem to think. That was risk-based. And then after we resumed Peel after COVID activity in 2021, we took this new continuous assessment approach. So we've had 2 rounds of that now, and each time we've amended it slightly. But in terms of what's coming next, we're right at the end now. The last 3 or 4 forces that have not been reported on for this round, we're starting for the next 2 years, and it's pretty relentless for chiefs, I have to say. So I'm sure many people will be delighted that we're starting so soon, probably around about August time. What's changed? We're bringing in fraud as a core question. It's the first time a single type of crime that we've inspected, but we've done 2 thematic inspections into fraud previously. We had 16 recommendations and 5 areas for improvement. And when we did a revisit in August 21, only 10 of those 16 have been implemented over those 4 or 5 years. Fraud is such a big part now of all crime, up to maybe 50% of some recorded crime. We felt it's critical. We try and act as a bit of a catalyst for improving performance around that. We brought custody into the Peel inspection as well. That was separate before. So forces would previously have a custody inspection about once every 6 years. It's going to be about once every 4 years now. It's going to be every other Peel cycle for yourselves. We're going to look at leadership and how you're supporting and developing the workforce more intrinsically and fundamentally. We're going to keep public treatment, which was one of our core questions. Prevention, deterrence, enabled policing is going to stay the same. Responding to the public is staying the same. That's our worst performing area. Again, along with investigating crime, they're both staying. And we've got rid of the vulnerability separate question. We're going to look at the safeguarding of children and adults within every single question, at every single stage of the process, not as a separate one. So they're the main changes. Fraud is the headline one, and custody coming back in, and vulnerability going, but safeguarding right the way through the whole inspection. The other one to mention is we're taking a pause on Mossovo and Pollitt. So the management of sexual RSOs, sexual offenders, violent offenders, and then the Pollitt stuff is being paused for 2 years. We're going to do a thematic around that, and if we do pick up any major issues, we would come in. But we had to create space for the inspectorate, in terms of our affordability for these inspections, and secondly, to make it manageable for forces, because these are really intrusive, they are disruptive, forces do take it seriously. So those are the changes that we're going to have in the future, but it's still going to be our 2-year cycle.
Yeah. When you're looking at fraud, are you have you got a sense of what you expect local forces should be doing on fraud? Because I think in some ways that's part of the problem, isn't it? It's been a bit unclear what a local force should be doing on fraud, and there's a bit of sort of shunting, because we've got our national crime reporting portal and action fraud. It sort of almost takes the ownership of fraud out of local forces. But do you have a sense going in there to do Peel what you think local forces should be doing in that space?
Yeah, I mean, we've built in the sort of performance framework with forces, with experts from City of London Action Fraud, and other critical sort of readers as well. So we have been doing that with the sector, not to them, which is important because they know their business. In short, the inspection is going to focus on the local policing response to fraud. So we're going to ask whether or not individual forces understand the impact of fraud in its communities. So do they understand what's going on, the intelligence picture, the risk assessment, part of their strategic assessment, and have they put resources in the result? And then we're going to assess through some sampling of crime investigations about whether or not we assess that the force provides a quality service to victims of fraud. I've given a commitment on behalf of the board to all chiefs that we're not here to set them up to fail. This is the first time that we're coming in and look at this. We know the challenges that they have around resources and finances. I started off this session by actually, talking about the challenges that chiefs have got. There is a degree of pragmatism, and we are going to work with them. We're not setting them up to fail here as well. It will be a catalyst for improvements, we hope. When we've gone in and we've inspected areas, it's been a catalyst for improvements for the public. But I have given those assurances because some people could quietly say, well, we know it's not a priority for many forces. You could end up with 43 inadequates. That's not the intention. We are going to apply a contextual element to this is a first inspection about an area that has exponentially increased over the last 5 years, and it's only going one way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And could you say a bit about, have we got you talked about the pressure on chief constables, how have we got the balance right between, you'll often hear chief constables talk about how they feel that they are, if you like, you know, they're highly accountable. You know, there's lots of different sources of accountability on them. I mean, do you think, in terms of inspection, do you think the balance is right between the challenge that you pose and the support that's offered to help forces improve?
So the inspectorate has a key role, I think, in policing, and it has a key role in trust and confidence in policing as well, but not at the expense of highlighting when things aren't right, because we're an independent inspectorate. So, you know, just to reiterate, our job is to ask the questions the public wish to be answered, to help communities compare and understand performance at a national level, which is absent without us. It helps them know if policing is effective, competent, fair, and it's to try and see policing through the public eyes as an independent inspectorate. I think chief constables, and I did as a chief constable, if I'm really honest, I felt that the inspection regime was relentless. The scrutiny and the accountability in policing is at a level that I don't see in any other public sector. But I think that's more of a case for me because of how important policing is, and the ability to take somebody's liberty away by the use of force in a liberal democracy is a very, very important public sector. I think this is not about bringing policing down in terms of accountability and scrutiny. As an ex-chief constable and as a HMI, I think it's about actually bringing the same level of accountability and scrutiny for other areas of the system, particularly when there are examples of policing sometimes being the victim of collateral demand that can historically be easily passed on. And the culture of policing can be sometimes to say, yes, we'll take that. And they find it very difficult sometimes to say no. Our job is to support chief constables. I haven't forgotten the underlying hypervigilance of leading an organisation. It's relentless. It's like being in background radiation and you actually don't realise the impact sometimes till you walk away. So my respect for those doing the job is strong. And we are really trying to get to a position where we can, through an early warning approach with the college and Chiefs Council and the inspectorate, we have no forces in engage. We have no forces failing because we don't want them to fail. We're able, through positive practice, good practice and support, to get to them quickly and to support them to prevent some of the problems that have been all too well documented in the last 10 years about forces failing happening again. That's really got to be the goal.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, I think we're almost at time there, Lee. I mean, thank you so much, and apologies to Alex and Anthony who've asked questions we haven't got to yet. So sorry about that. It's just we just have so many questions, but a really fascinating conversation, Lee. Thank you so much, and I'm sure the audience really enjoyed that and got a lot out of it. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and just to let you know that our next session, we're still trying to get the date of it, but it is, I think it's not next week, the week after is actually the 10th anniversary of the founding of the National Police Chiefs Council, and so we're going to be doing an event with the NPCC, with the chair of the NPCC, Gavin Stevens, at some point in the next couple of weeks. And we may have a couple of other special guests on that call as well, to talk about how policing's developed over the last 10 years since the NPCC was brought in, and where it's going now with all of the police reform conversation that's clearly happening at a national level. So do keep an eye on our social media feeds, and do come along to that conversation in the next couple of weeks. But in the meantime, thanks all for being here, and thanks very much to Lee for spending some time with us this afternoon.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you, everybody.
Cheers.